Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Wayne. I'm with Anadea Judith. Hi, Anadea.
Hello, everyone.
And with Mary Adams from in Costa Rica. And
hello, everybody.
Hi, Mary. So the name of our program tonight is Changing Consciousness Through Radical Activism. And as we'll hear from Mary, she walks her talk. So Mary is the co-founder of Third Space, executive director and trustee of Emergence Foundation, and supporting social and environmental projects across the UK and Europe. She spent decades in India and US and the US exploring the relationship between consciousness and culture, including 25 years in an intentional community co-pioneering intersubjective dialogue practices, along with running programs in Europe and the US. And currently Mary is based in London, where she engages in writing intercultural dialogue and radical nonviolent civil disobedience. And as Mary wrote, and I'll just say what she wrote, she wrote that there's been a resurgence of radical activism today in response to the meta crisis. And as someone who has dedicated her life to the exploration of consciousness and spiritual practice, Mary has dived deeply into civil disobedience, resulting in multiple arrests and prison. And so today we'll be speaking about the relationship of these two seemingly disparate paths, the path of consciousness and the path of radical activism. So Mary, welcome. And so it'd be good to give everyone a little bit of your background, your spiritual trajectory, and then what brought you to engage in the path of radical activism, after developing so much of your life to the development of consciousness.
Great. Well, thank you, Michael and Anadea, for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to share this with your audience as well. Where to start? I mean, I think like a lot of us, I began my sort of path, I think, in the 70s really, and I was fairly disillusioned with, well, not disillusioned with sort of Western culture. In terms of meaning and purpose, I felt that at an early age when I was, and so I studied Eastern philosophy and Sanskrit at university, and then I left university and I headed east, which I later discovered many other people did too. And I must have spent in my life probably about 15 years living and working in India, and 7 unbroken years in my early youth. And that had a very profound, I met a lot of had a profound effect on me. I met a lot of very, well-known and I would say legendary, teachers, which I spent time with, etc. So that was a period, I think, where I really dived deep. And India, the thing that was significant about that at the time is India, naturally, there is not a separation between at the depth of its philosophical, spiritual thought and thinking and practice and its culture. They're wedded, and it doesn't mean India doesn't have a lot of problems. It does, particularly now, but the two are there's not a separation between the two, and that always intrigued me and fascinated me, and it made deep sense to So I spent a lot of my youth there and studying and working and, in India, doing a lot of meditation, etc. And then I moved west. I moved to London, and I was part of a spiritual community there. We set up what is now the main Vipassana meditation mindfulness center in UK. Actually, a group of us continued and set that up then. And I dived, actually, at that point, I dived into psychology. I felt that I wanted to have a grasp of that. So I studied psychotherapy for several years. I practiced it. I balanced those two. Then fast forward, I went to America. I was part of an intentional community for over 25 years, really dedicated to personal development within a cultural context. There was very much that inner work needed to be able to impact and have an effect on the outer, on culture, the relation between culture, consciousness and culture. But it was fairly inwardly directed. And as you said, I think in my bio, we did a lot of work on collective intelligence and dialogue, evolutionary dialogue, etc. So from there, at about a decade ago, almost now, I went back to Europe and I went back to India. I had been to India intermittently between, but not for long periods. And I began to really, I think my political consciousness got reawakened, and that relationship between the two, between the inner work and outer. And I think more than that, I began in India to meet people who were very aware of history, the impact of history, the colonialism, etc. And I began to put a lot of pieces together and to look at my own culture, Western thinking, Western political building blocks of Western thinking now, and look at the effects that's had in terms of the systems we have today, economically, our economic system, our political system, etc., etc. So I began to put those two together, consciousness and culture, I began to step back and see in a bigger way and then very quickly I began to see the results of a culture, meaning my own Western culture, that largely was operating out of a position of a Descartesian position of separation, really object, subject, etc., etc. And that showed up in, one of the things that showed up in is our relationship to the planet, and with the extractivism, etc. And and the sort of lingering current expressions of colonialism, really, in our global finance system. That all began to fall into place. And I met a lot of people who were very involved in that. And of course, very quickly, the climate emerged as being, born in Australia, a family Australian. I haven't been back and lived there since I left, but lived in California for a long time, and India. All of those places are really on the front lines, a lot of the climate, and particularly in the last 5 years. So I began to put all those things together. And anyway, very quickly, I wanted to know more too. So I did a 3-day immersion with Al Gore in 2016, 17. He does these with science. He brings scientists in from all over the world, and you really hear what's going on. But just to say what affected me most about that it was a real wake up, was I shared this with someone else the other day, was the heartbrokenness of those scientists who are academics, the research. It was unbelievable, who were speaking from various areas of expertise, from the barrier reef to, the forest, all over the world. And I realized, we are in an existential crisis with this, and we're just continually, we're barreling on. And to me, what we're barreling on with is based on still on a philosophical and spiritual, you could say an absence of spiritual, but a particular worldview that is more than outdated.
More
has
than
had its
outdated.
time, and that led me. Sorry?
Yes, very much
How,
more than
sorry?
outdated. Yes. Lots
Yes,
of time and
exactly. Very
purpose.
much more than
Yeah.
outdated. Yes. So I began to, and then in Britain, in 2018, there was a climate movement, a climate sort of began called Extinction Rebellion, which you're probably familiar with. I think it's a little different in America, I want to say that, but it began there, and it began, 10,000 people came out. And I went along, and I went to a talk on civil disobedience. And that was my first sort of introduction to it in the West in this context. And I just went, I was curious. And what I really liked, it had a lot of principles to it. And I'm not going to go into those on this right now. But this movement was very principled, and it was grounded in Gandhian nonviolence, which, as we all know, is Martin Luther King used too. And I was very struck by the deeply spiritual nature of it, and the deep sense of it, and the fact that there was that many people that realized we actually have to stop and do something, because at that point in Britain, nothing was being said about the climate crisis and its associated, the meta crisis, really, because they're obviously interlinked. Nothing was being said, nothing in the news, nothing in the media. And there was this huge turnout, and I think for a week, all the major bridges into central London were blocked.
Wow.
And it was profound, yes. And there were three demands being made to the government, and the very first one was to tell the truth. And I don't think the profundity of that has really sort of I've grown into, you could say, over the last few years, because I realized without actually knowing what's going on, people, we exist, we continue on as if, we're not aware that we are actually in an existential crisis. And you see, to me, what's so profound about this, it's a crisis we can, well, at this point we can't avert, but we can definitely ameliorate. And that's what really drives me. So then from then on, it was one step after another, and I got more and more, I got more and more involved, basically. Yes.
It sounds like I'm involved in a lot. Do you feel that your years of I'll say, student of spirituality, your years in meditation communities and all that, really prepared you for the path you're walking now? Was it really essential when you look back?
I do, actually, and I feel it is really, it's part of it, really, because I feel it's coming from the sort of impetus for activism to actually do something is coming from a place of profound love and recognition. It's not really, that's what I like about it. It's not a movement against, it's a movement for. It's a movement of care that's being motivated by that. And I think in terms of my own engagement with, there's a lot of discipline, a lot of self-sacrifice. You have to be very autonomous. You have to really be able to let go in very intense, sort of emotional moments. And I think all of my past has helped that. In fact, they use many of those tools. They offer them to people who engage actually meditation. But I feel you're alone a lot. In fact, you're with a group, but you actually can't do this at this level unless you're willing to be very alone, which means connected to your own conviction, really.
When you say you're not,
which is very similar.
Do you mean the civil disobedience? You're not able to do the civil disobedience, unless you're willing to confront yourself alone, even though you do it with
exactly. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So Mary, let's define nonviolent. People have it in mind when they hear it, but perhaps you could define the term nonviolent civil disobedience, and how is it being applied in the case of climate activism?
I think my internet was a little out. I think I got it, Michael.
I'll repeat it.
One thing is, if you repeat the beginning of it, I got the second part.
Okay. Well, I was saying the phrase nonviolent civil disobedience, people understand. I mean, here in the US, we we still have the memory and film, it's on film, of the freedom fighters in the 50s and 60s, civil rights activists, and sitting at the counter at Woolworths and places in the South where blacks weren't allowed. So, but anyway, I thought it'd be good to give a frame, a parameter of defining what you mean, what civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience means for you, and then how you would apply it, how it gets applied to climate activism.
Yes. Well, it's interesting you mentioned the freedom riders, because we do a lot of study of that, because we use a lot of Martin Luther King's strategies, actually, and I can say more about that later. And they're obviously here, and Gandhi are huge. Really, what nonviolent civil disobedience means, you're consciously breaking the law, right? To begin, that's a start, but you're doing it within a context for something that's more important. You could call it out of necessity. There's even a law, the law of necessity, where it means you can break the law for a higher reason, that there's a larger threat. So that's the sort of context. But the nonviolent heart of it means that it's not only about not being violent. Active stance within you of surrender, that you're willing to use your own vulnerability as the whatever, the modus operandi, the tool, in order to carry out what you're doing. So the actual actions themselves are generally two-pronged. You have to do something that's disruptive. Just protest, just anything anymore in Britain. They really don't mind. You march around for years and nobody's really going to mind. And people have done everything. Me too. My MP knows me so well. Everyone's done every other way they can do it. So actually means you're going out, you're going to do an action that'll be highly disruptive to it's going to catch the government's eye, it's going to catch the media's eye. And so what we did, the first actions we did, was to block highways. And when I say highways, around those of you who know London, there's massive circular freeway, you could say it's a motorway, around London, which is literally the artery to the capital city. And so to block that, there's a series of junctions. If you hold up the traffic on that, it's extremely disruptive. So that's one of the tactics, to block entrances of the oil tankers coming in and out. Now, the main purpose is not to cause enormous disruption to people, because it does. If you cause traffic, but the purpose is there's obviously some sort of, there's usually a banner to say why we're there, and there are people there who are explaining why we're there. But the purpose of this kind of disruption is you create enough disruption to attract the media, which then creates pressure on the government, because it's not just the action itself, but we have many people, many of them young, who go into the newsrooms, they go on talk shows, they get invited into the BBC to discuss the issue itself. So the action really is a shortcut, really, to getting the attention on the issue. And so you have to do something that's disruptive enough and continuously enough. If you do one spectacle, which Greenpeace often does, incredible spectacles, the government, they don't mind. It has to be, by disruptive, it has to be, in this case, ongoing enough. We did this for 5 weeks, and we had front page media for 5 weeks because it was so disruptive. And I think people could not believe that people were doing this. And it was tough, I have to say, very, very tough. And it's hard. It's not something that you do lightly. It's not fun just to hold people up. And I very quickly learned that a lot of people have no real knowledge of the crisis we're in. And so to them, it makes no sense. So an enormous amount of education has to go on, and the media helps with that, I have to say.
Yeah, and they have
but the main thing, the nonviolent.
Yeah,
exactly. They have to. You has to be disruptive enough to get the media's attention, I have to hate to say it, but it has to be.
Yeah, so that sounds like that's really your express goal, to get the media attention, to raise the consciousness around the denial of climate change, and to get the, how many people does
Exactly.
it take to do all that? That takes a lot of coordination.
Well, it does. Well, just to back up a little bit, Anna, Extinction Rebellion was very effective. The second year we were there, Britain declared a state of emergency, the pilot, that we are in a climate emergency. It was the first government to do that, simply because these thousands of people were blocking central London. But by the third year, they knew we'd be gone in 10 days, or they didn't mind anymore. It didn't have the impact. So this was taken a step further. Clearly, we were about 100 people, started off at 70, we went up to maybe 120, but doing it again and again and again, a small group of people can have quite a big effect. Because, and just to say too for your audience, the context is Britain versus America is a very small country with 60, 70 million people. And I think a lot of us feel Britain is part of the G7. It's a very powerful country, even though it's a very small one. We could affect change there. It would definitely have ripples, particularly in Europe first. Really, and when I say change, I'm talking about a real, genuine transition, the beginning of a transition, putting the mechanisms in place for a real transition out of fossil fuels, and then all the interrelated changes that need to happen with that. So yeah, so it's a very real target, really, we have, and you need the media to do it, to create pressure, just as you said, on the government.
Yeah, and to raise the consciousness of all the people to say this is something.
Exactly.
Denial is really quite remarkable for something
remarkable.
So serious and so devastating and so preventable. I mean, it's just makes you want to pull your hair out. Yeah, I'm glad you are doing something. Yeah, there's so much of a dichotomy between spirituality and activism in so many people's minds, that all we have to do is just raise consciousness and everything will take care of itself. And then the activists that are not doing their spiritual work, that come with too much anger, and then they're discounted as just some crazies, and they don't have the effect they want. So there's really, this bridge is needed. Yeah. Michael, I think it's
exactly. And just to pick up on some.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Mary.
Oh,
I was just going to say, to pick up on what you said, I actually have come to see that, because there's a lot of young people, there tends to be people my age who are, sort of, able to do it, and then people young, meaning students, or that sort of age, are some in the middle. And I almost have a transformative effect, particularly on the young people who engage in this nonviolent civil disobedience, because, as I said, you have to really let go of a lot of your opinions, your sort of reactions, your fears, and step into a situation that's very unknown. You're stepping at, these are all lawful people. You're putting yourself in some degree of danger. There has been physical, attacks on activists. B, you're definitely lining yourself up. You will be arrested in Britain now, and now many of us have faced prison or been in prison. It's getting more and more difficult. And I've seen that young people particularly come from cynicism, hopelessness, despair, to a sense of urgency, a sense of purpose. They feel they can affect the future. They feel they're willing to give their future. And I find it heartbreaking. A lot of them have given up college. A lot of them are working class people who are not going to be easy for them to get jobs later. And I feel there's something also wrong in our society that has to happen, that young people feel they have to do that. But it is having a transformative effect. I see the kind of community that is emerging from that, not a fixed community, it's not an ideological community, but the kind of caring for each other, support. There's a lot of small things that happen that really touch me very deeply. And I'll give you one example. When you do an action like that, you will be arrested. You go to a police station, you can only be held 24 hours, but you're held 24 hours in a cell with nothing, very, very bleak. And and then you're released under investigation, they say, and then they determine whether they're going to take it further or not. And that release, you'll probably be between 7 or 8 people in one particular police station. They tend to send us to different ones. Everybody waits until the last person has been released. And when we were first doing this, it was bitterly cold. So sometimes at 2 a.m. in the morning, you'd be waiting like 2 hours for the last person to come. But there's justice. And when you do, you've been through this sort of trauma, really. And you see that, but it's a positive trauma. I want to say that there's this enormous sense of, that you're doing something together, and you come out, and these are strangers to me. When I first went in, I knew nobody, and I felt like that's my family. You really felt this. There's a lot of, positive things get generated, and I see people making enormous sacrifices. And also, these are middle-class people, most of them working class, middle class, some academics, some scientists, and it's from all over. People are sort of, we have to live in safe houses. I don't know if that makes sense, but when you go on an action, you don't just turn up, you actually prepare together, you work together. It's like a military operation. So you go to these houses, safe houses, where you have no access to any devices. Your partner, your family do not know where you're going. You go and you're with this group of strangers, and people, they work together. They no one complains about the conditions, because obviously you're sort of like college dorms, really. And it's remarkable. There's just incredible spirit. And it's born because people feel the power of coming together for something higher and trying to affect change.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, I've studied trauma a lot, and people become traumatized when they're passive, but taking action actually offsets the experience of trauma. So we become traumatized by the news. We become traumatized by, because we sit there passively. And so whether this has an effect on changing culture or changing legislation, it has an effect on the people that do it, because they are actually, at least they're doing something,
Yes,
they're not sitting quietly. Yeah.
that's
Go
right.
ahead, Michael.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So, Mary, I want to add on to what Anadea mentioned earlier about people who are involved in the development of consciousness. Some prefer to stay out of any sort of politics or activism, just stay apolitical, and feeling that if we just meditate more, get more spiritual, develop our consciousness, that by itself will change the world. So since that's in your background, what would you say to people like that who think that way?
Sorry, Michael, I lost that. I didn't hear that. I heard the first part. I heard the question, but I didn't hear what you said. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So for, we talked about the two paths, the path consciousness, spirituality, and you've been in both worlds. And sometimes they're disparate, the world of consciousness development, world of activism. So, and some people who are interested in development of consciousness development, personal development, they prefer to stay out of politics, stay apolitical, and they feel just if I get more spiritual, if we raise the vibration and reach more oneness, that will change the world of and by itself. So I'm wondering what you would say to people who are of that camp.
Well, I think it hasn't, and I think what's so far, I'm very familiar with, as you said, with that way of thinking, and not that I don't feel sustained, very deep spiritual practice and inquiry is important. I do, and people who go and spend extended periods doing that, I have all respect. I think it's critical. But I think I think it's a false separation, actually. And I think it's not that meditation, group meditation, just not that it isn't having any effect at all. But I think what's very apparent right now is we have very little time. And I think it's very clear that there are very aspiritual forces that are directing our shared future. And I feel that engaging with the process in whatever way, and look, this is one strand, I feel, in a tapestry of ways we can respond. There are people working, as you both know, in all kinds of ways, in agriculture and economics, and in the degrowth movement, the regenerative movement. There's many, many responses to this crisis that I think are very critical, because I actually do think we are probably going to take the route of crash landing, and then we need to have things in place, right, that are developed. And so that work's very, very important. But I think pushing at the center, illuminate the center, illuminate, exposing what's not working to a larger public. I think the mainstream, it's very important. And I think this sort of the fact that I've been fortunate enough in my life to have done the kind of spiritual practice I've done, I feel this is something that's needed for, and they're not separate. Somehow in my mind, it's one straight line through. So I feel, to those people who feel apolitical, I feel we can't afford now to separate the two. It doesn't mean they've got to go out in the streets, but I think we all have to be thinking about the systems that are reflecting a certain consciousness, a very spiritual, to say the least. And I think we have to be thinking, we have to have our consciousness on the fact that we are in a meta crisis, but not just in a despondent way, which is an easy route to go. But if as we all know, probably, if we put our hearts and minds and our very beings together in conversations, we raise the consciousness, our behaviors start to change in any which way. That's all part of it. And I'm of the age where I remember tobacco. I grew up where smoking was a very cool, chic thing to do, et cetera, et cetera. And then it was we were. And there was an enormous amount of work going on in the medical community and activism community. And then at a certain point, it felt to me, it suddenly change overnight, right? Because as we know, similar to the fossil fuel and tobacco industry was keeping the public in the dark and, through misleading information, et cetera. But suddenly there was a shift. And I feel denial and avoidance means consciousness, there's a general consciousness doesn't change, but when we all start to become aware of something and care about it, no matter whether we're on the street or not, I'm not saying we should. I think that's very personal, and probably a small group of people that are going to do that. But even the support of that helps. To know you have the public or you have people behind it, it helps. It means we're all in it together, and I think that's very powerful. That is consciousness. And so I just feel we can't afford anymore to separate those two, really.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Michael.
And to add on to what you're saying, Mary, that Martin Luther King and Gandhi were very deeply spiritual, deeply religious people. Right. And so they brought
exactly.
a of wisdom with them. And they saw
Definitely.
that like you're talking, that intersubjective camaraderie and collaboration that comes from that raises a vibration of and by itself as they're doing the actions that they're
exactly.
Yeah.
No, exactly, Michael. And it's interesting because, like America, we have some real problems with our police force in Britain. And if you've seen it, there's a lot going on at the moment. But in the course of the last year, since I've been involved in different actions, I've come into contact with a lot of police, lots of police, and some of them have been younger. And it's really made me, it's opened up as it always does. It opens up your own sort of fixed ideas about things. And a lot of these young police, ushers, guards, drivers who we interact with, just to speak to the point you made, are very affected simply by who we are. And no one's special, but it's because of the depth, the embrace of non-violence deeply at a very deep spiritual level. People care. there's no like, well, this is the place. People really, there's an empathic, and I would say contextualized understanding that the whole of that we're not being educated. People don't know. So you can't, there's very little blaming and shaming and separation and,
Right.
oh, we're doing this great thing and you don't get, it's none of that. There's a real care. And in that, people are very effective. They just are. And I've seen, I can't even countless police officers really get engaged in deep conversations about this.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Mm.
Now, you refer to it
Mm.
as a meta crisis, of which I totally agree. I
Mm.
mean, not only is it such a huge, colossal thing that's coming down, it's something our brains aren't quite prepared for to think on that kind of scale, but it has so many fingers in so many different parts of society. One analogy I heard is, the climate is sort of like the fever of someone. And you can say, well, let's bring down the fever, but that doesn't cure the disease, And if they have an infection, if they're polluted, if they have cancer or whatever, just bringing down the fever. So it's not just bringing down the temperature, that temperature is a result of a whole way that we're living, a whole set of assumptions, a whole economic system, a whole political system, a whole organizational system, the way people are organized to live here and commute in a car to work every day.
Exactly.
An hour.
Exactly.
So it's that meta system that we have to address. And so how can this activism, speak into that and begin to, we even have a question here from Grace. Can it be possible to bring actual dialogue between business and international government and civilian interests to look at this from an economic, finance, power balance, political lifestyle issue discussion, because I think so many people feel, oh, this is so big. What can I do?
Right. Yes. It's interesting because I think as you said, climate is the fever, really. It's also the sort of most, you could say, far-reaching expression, sort of something that's gone deeply astray at the heart of our culture, the soul of it, really. And as you were saying, Anna, it's everything. It permeates our economic system, our political system, everything, just as you said. So
and it will be more
it's
disruptive
interesting
than anything that we've encountered.
Yes, exactly.
More disruptive than a war, more disruptive than an economic collapse.
That's
more disruptive
right.
than, yeah.
That's right. But it's all connected. It's all connected. They're all
that's right.
interlinked, which is why. Now, there's two ways I want to speak to. I want to say that I see this nonviolent climate activism really serving one element of, as I said, it's a thread in a tapestry, and its function is, I think, to stop the harm. It's simply saying we are in an emergency. We need to stop certain things. That's definitely not enough. It's as many of us know, just creating green consumerism, and it's not going to work. But we need to stop the harm, and part of that. And the other thing is to awaken what I would say is consciousness in the public, to be honest. As we were talking about before, if you have a public that's very distracted, passive, and look, a lot of people are incredibly focused, understandably, on life is very hard now. It's very hard in Britain. I think it's also in the States for a lot of people. So they've got survival issues. So they're not going to be paying attention to this. But there's another huge swath of people who aren't on survival level, but whose attention would have a huge effect on this. And it's about, I think, creating space, stopping the harm, creating space, kind of conversations that Grace is pointing out. There are expertise in post-growth or degrowth economic. There are experts in regenerative farming. There are experts in regenerative architecture, in infrastructure, transport, all of that. And there's something else that the climate movement has come up with, which is citizens' assemblies. Yeah. So rather like a jury, you have these huge assemblies assemblies that really represent, who themselves become educated by these experts, and then they become advisors to the government, because I think we all understand a government it's not going to be able to have the answers. How can they? But that way, the ordinary citizens, plus those who at the moment are a little bit more on the periphery, better and providing viable alternatives, could work together. You educate citizens' assemblies. Those citizens' assemblies then work with different ministers in the government. And you start to sort of have a decentralized but inclusive. You start to include your citizenry in the solutions, and I think that's very important. But I see this as not the answer, but as one important thread, because all those other things are going on. But as long as we have, as we were saying before, this nexus of power and money, they don't really care about regenerative agriculture, but you have to put a lot of pressure there to get them at least to stop doing what they're doing, to create the space for these other conversations and policies to come in.
Yeah, so that's an important point you brought up, Mary, the nexus of politics and money, and especially money. Just a couple of weeks ago in Davos, Switzerland, the World Economic Forum met once again. And as Greta Thunberg has said, it's just a lot of blah, blah, blah. They give good lip service to doing good for the world, but it's always as long as they're making money, as long as they're protecting their interests. So here, the oil companies, the fossil fuel companies are announcing their profits for 2022, and they're all setting records and records and records, new records.
Exactly.
And they just won't stop that addiction to the money, to extracting. I mean, our whole economy is extracting energy from the earth, fossil fuel, and extracting money from people's pockets. And it's like a sickness that just doesn't stop. So ultimately, it's like a machine that just has so much momentum, can't stop. And so that's kind of like not even a question, just a rhetorical comment. But I'm wondering, what your thoughts on how do you stop the machine?
Well, I think there's multiple approaches, but I think in a certain way, that's where I actually feel non-violent civil disobedience comes in. There's a group of people willing to say, no, this is not okay. Because as I said before, along with the actual actions, there's a lot of time in newsrooms like this with people having conversations about the bigger issues and the interlocking and the whole meta crisis and its interlocking crises and the ways forward. So I think it's very important to expose this nexus, right, for what it is, and to put pressure on it, actually. And that doesn't take a lot of people. And that's why I think Martin Luther King and Gandhi, they eventually just said, no, change has to happen. And I think that's really what this is about at the moment. Climate activism right now is about that. It's pushing for some kind of real engagement by the government, and it's willing to send people to prison, or people are willing to go to prison for that. And just to say that part of it, I just want to give, is a very important part of it, because the public feel uncomfortable. They're starting to feel uncomfortable because a lot of us going to prison by seeing people like me. I'm a grandmother. I'm head of a, there's students there. They're seeing lawful people go to prison. I mean, recently, a young man, his name's Louis, I'm not allowed to say it, but he just got out on bail after 214 days, held on remand, which for those of you who don't know means he hasn't been tried yet. And he was put onto remand for that long because he has a big effect on young activists across Europe. He's very articulate, he's very authentic, he's very sincere, he's very humble. And so the government wanted him away. That's 7 months without any conviction. So they're worried, right? They're trying to silence this, but at the same time, if we can get the press to write and expose that, that starts to create public conscience, to be honest. There are people, and I've recently been told by people who are, I'm in touch with, that parts of the judiciary, the legal system, lawyers, judges, are beginning to feel very uncomfortable with what they call judicial overreach, where the government, where our judiciary system is aligning itself with the government position on climate activism. I mean, basically, we're sending prisoners of conscience, really. I mean, no one's, breaking laws to the degree that they demand those sort of prison sentences. So it's having an effect in that way too. I feel it's pushed within the culture itself, and a moral conscience, I think, that is usually, as you both said, we're fed distraction. We're fed, we're encouraged to be passive and comfortable and reassured and et cetera, et cetera. And that leads to, this I consider it almost a disease of normalization. Things that shouldn't be normalized have become normalized. And so this is pushing against that too.
Yeah. In evolution, for a system to evolve, and this is really a systemic problem that we're addressing.
Yes.
For a system to evolve, the current system has to be disrupted. There has to be a disruption in the business as usual. The alcoholic has to hit bottom and get divorced or lose his job, or, something has to crash and be disrupted.
Yeah.
And it's a very powerful system. So some people just say, well, this disruption is a nuisance. I wish they would just go away. I want to get on with my day. I had a hard day at work and I'm trying to get across the bridge. I already know about climate change. But this sense of, because climate change itself will be a huge disruptor of everything that we take for granted. All our supply chains and our medicines and our ability to take a shower and, the diseases and, so many things that even people who, I think all of us are in denial of climate change because we cannot really wrap our heads around 125-degree heat day after day and not enough water to take a shower and the village next door burning. We have not been in that situation. So even when we read about climate change, we can't wrap our heads around it. And we need to do so in a way that gives people hope, because when they come into despair, they get paralyzed. So I don't know what you would say to that.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Well, it's interesting because in a way despair is sorry, was you talking, Michael?
Oh, no,
sorry. That we have a slight gap.
Yeah. Time lag.
Despair is, I think, it's hanging over all of our shoulders, right? I think. And I think what really gives a lot of the people I meet who are willing to, who've certainly crossed a line. So I have to say, I hadn't quite taken in what crossing that line of being a lawful person was and going to prison and, it's a big deal. You don't even realize when you do it that that's happened. But it's a very powerful thing. I think it gives you a very deep sense of not just personal empowerment, but strength. There's a conviction when you start to do that for something higher, because you are saying, I am personally not. And so I'm not aligning anymore with this system, as you described, Anadea and Michael. It's a systemic system. I'm not aligning with that, and I'm going to be vocal about that, and I'm not going to be non-violent about that, and I'm going to, et cetera, et cetera. That begins to, I think, for people who engage with us or with that, see.
Oh, she froze. She froze. She's in Costa Rica where the internet's a little weak.
Yeah, we've done pretty well. Hopefully you'll be right back, Mary.
We do have some questions, and we should, if this was a good point, while she's frozen, hopefully she can unfreeze and come back in. for people, we're coming to the end of the hour, to form your questions. You can write them in the chat. Some people have already done so, or you can raise your hand where the little button says raise hand or reactions. Mary, you are frozen.
Okay,
She's probably going to sign back on.
I was just going to suggest you get off.
Yeah.
The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Gutteres, has really been outspoken about climate change, and he hasn't minced words on what's that action is needed. And he berates the countries, he berates the business leaders, the people who are making all the money. He's spoken out with all the, as I was talking about, the fossil fuel companies and their record profits. He's talked about that and just tries to shame them. He's really not being just a stereotypical diplomat trying to play all sides and make nice. Anyone could look up some of the speeches he's giving, go on YouTube, or just put in his name, Antonio, if you're not familiar with him, and I'll spell his name.
Yeah.
Gutteres. Yeah, it's really powerful things he's been talking about.
And it needs to be done, and we need to get the media on it. Even some of the more progressive news stations, MSNBC, for example, I never hear them mention climate change. They'll go on and on about Trump and this and that, but they don't talk about climate actions. They don't talk about the seriousness of climate. There's so many places, New York Times does quite a bit on climate. But in general, the news media is not, because I think people don't want to hear it. They think they can't do anything about it, and then they just want to turn it off. I have friends that tell me I talk about climate change too much.
Yeah. And all this extreme weather. Hi, Mary. Hopefully you can get your video back on.
Hi. Yes.
I want to, talking about action, radical activism, you had written an essay where you started out talking about the people who've been doing those disruptive acts of, and I may not get this right, of throwing milk on art in Van Gogh, or just doing some glue themselves to artwork too, or and some will say, oh, tisk, that's just wrong thing to do. But you addressed that in that essay, so I'm wondering if you could talk more about that, and I'll put the link to the essay. Yeah, so why don't you say some about that?
Yeah, it's very well written.
Yes. Yeah, apologies everyone for the internet. It's a little fragile here. Yes.
And did you hear my question, Mary? What
I did. Yes. I mean, it's interesting because over the summer, this recent summer, a lot of young students joined this movement, and motivated, as I said, out of I think it was motivated by, well, not I think, I know from talking to them, they were the ones, it was mostly young people engaged in things like what you're speaking about, is throwing a can of soup on Van Gogh in one of Britain's museum art galleries. Now, when I first saw that, I thought, and I even wrote on the threads, because we have active, I thought, well, that seems just vandalism, And then I realized, no, it's very carefully thought through. It was glass encased. Every one of those extreme actions were very carefully done to not damage anything. But they were, in a way, very, what those young people were responding to was something we just referred to, the pool of normalization that we live in now. We swim in it. And when we see it, and it's contributed to a 24-hour news cycle doesn't help. We see something horrific happening, 24 hours, we've forgotten it, and we're on to something else. And so much has become normalized. And as one of you was just saying recently, our lifestyles even, there's such a force to keep our lifestyles going in the way they are, rather than looking at, well, how can we really change at scale? I'm not about just individually, but individually too, individually and at scale. But these young people, they're partly what they were doing was trying to shock in the context that, hey, everybody, wake up. we are in a crisis. It's a systemic crisis of which the climate is, the most visible and extreme, threatening. And so these acts were done to disrupt the normalcy of things and to provoke conversation. And I have to say, I changed my thought, in engaging with them. Some of them I know I've met, and is fascinating because Phoebe, who threw the soup, young woman at college, she ended up being in the BBC newsroom with, I think, Christina Figueres from the UN on Zoom in the BBC, talking about the climate crisis, but also talking about the deadly or the lethal grip of the status quo, right? Status quo of consciousness that's being, nourished in a way, nurtured by vested interests, as we were talking about before. So those actions were very extreme, but they were within a context of these other actions, and again held within the whole, grounded in this nonviolent. Everyone who participates has to go through a pretty thorough training.
That's right, the nonviolent training. Yeah.
Exactly. But that's what those were for. They were very spectacle, like shocking, but they didn't damage anything, and a lot of care was taken to make sure they didn't. And it was to create this room for these conversations that needed.
Type your questions in if you have any questions for Mary or any comments, or raise your hand in the chat box and we'll get to you. We have a few comments coming in. Marie commented on the Heartland Conference, which the Heartland has been an organization that has been hugely into climate denying for a long time, and putting out propaganda.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that's a place where disruption has to happen in demonstration, those meetings to,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, I have a hungry cat that is trying to get my attention.
Yeah.
So Joanne has a comment or question. Survival from paycheck to paycheck and lack of media and adult awareness is fearful by many that these issues are what is going to kill us. Wondering myself as well, how to help this issue rectify itself. You get that question, Mary?
I think so. I think there's a lot of appreciation within the climate movement, and particularly this more radical sort of, you could say, wing of it, that most people, a lot of people now are in survival. They're literally going, as Joanne said, from paycheck to paycheck. And I think that there's another, as we're saying, another swath of people, who aren't at that level, but who are largely in avoidance and by no fault necessarily of their own. I think, our culture does a good job at keeping everything at bay. But I think by drawing attention to this and having it put into the national sort of consciousness, you could say, into the limelight through media, I think that if we can start to generate amongst us, not feel, not to feel that one is excluded from this, that it's not within one's sort of purview to be able to engage, but by even being aware of it and thinking and being aware, having conversations, I think, and starting to recognize that the paycheck by paycheck reality is part of the problem. They're all, these things are connected, as we said before, the economics, the sort of, particularly the economics between the global south and global north and globalization, that's very extreme. But within our own countries, the inequity, we have a system that does not work. So those people who are working in that way, by seeing people stand there and go, hey, the system is not working. Climate is the most extreme version of it. We have to stop destroying our environment, our planet, but also we need to change the system. So hopefully those people would feel there's someone standing up for them. There's someone saying, no, this is not working. and willing, as I said, to go to prison for it, willing to do that. And it does not rest on the small group of people. I want to emphasize this is one strand in a tapestry, but I think it's an important one, because I think all that other work is kept on the periphery by a center that is very, very powerful. And it's almost like, it's like a David Goliath thing. There's
right.
something there and it's visible. I think the visibility is very important. And it's interesting in Britain, there's a lot to talk about here. The moment we're having what they call the winter of discontent, trade unions across society are on strike. We have railways, we have nurses, we have border control, we have postmen. I mean, everyone is on strike, and there's a tremendous sort of empathy for those people, and we are supporting them. When I say we're supporting them verbally. Some people are going to their picket lines, etc. Because to make that connection, that climate activism is actually related to all of these issues, right? It's a system that isn't working anymore. And so in that way, I think people can feel more connected and more included without feeling they have to go out onto the streets themselves. But it feels less alien. Like, what's that got to do with me? Yes, it has everything to do with me because it's the system.
Yeah, and the proper metaphor, the popular metaphor that's always given for how we just don't deal with this in the right way is, the frog in the water, and the water just gets boiled, start raising the heat, and the frog just stays in there because by the time it's too hot, it's too late for it to get out.
Exactly, Michael. Yeah.
So
you see, I feel that's very real. Sorry, go ahead.
What would you say to the people who are listening, to the average person, about what they can do with their own sense of powerlessness, what they can do to help make this change of awareness around climate change or any other issue, whether it's racism or sexism or, the destruction of some natural habitat in their neighborhood, I mean, what would you say to invite them and get them activated?
Right. I would say, I think whatever it is, out of multiple, as you just named a number of them, Anadea, I think we have to I think we've reached a point where we need to be active. Now, some of us literally don't have the time. As we talked about, we're on survival, we're working, but even then we have time to talk to our family. We have time to talk to our neighbor, our workplace. I think even doing that around the issues that touch you, I think it's what touches oneself deeply. We need to start talking about that, thinking about that, caring about that, and sharing that. And the more privileged we are, the more which means the more time we have, the more space, in whatever way, our skills, our workplace, just conversations create consciousness. And then to take some risks, perhaps, or engage with your congressperson, your MP, do that, take that step. I honestly feel it all counts. And I think beginning to be, I don't think we can afford not to be engaged, right? And I think to start to act on the things we know. Part of that essay that you mentioned, Michael, it just struck me. We know so much as a population. We know, and to start to act on what we know. We know, for example, I think I wrote it there. We know that certain clothing is produced in certain. We know that now. Let's not buy it. We know we can start supporting the things that are good, and really acting on the things that aren't. And I think just at that level starts to make a difference. But also just not avoiding, not acting as if everything is normal. It actually isn't. Start to think about. Like, I fly to Costa Rica. Why? Because I can't get there by train. I never fly now, except for family. My family live here and work, where I have to. But to even begin to make those choices. I'm not an ideologue. I don't say no one do this, no one, stop completely, because I know our lives are complex. But I think to start to think and to make very conscious choices that are in alignment with our deepest values, to be honest, and in alignment with our own care, I feel the biggest antidote to the incredible sort of, what can I say, the daunting aspect of this is care. When we care, that's the biggest antidote, care at a deep level. And if we act on that care, step by step by step, just a little bit, it builds, and our strength builds, our sense of purpose builds. We start to find other people who think similarly, who are also caring, and then things emerge that we can do too. They start to opportunities arise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think also, going back to the spiritual part of nonviolence, disobedience, and talking about Gandhi, King, and just everybody, I think when you have that spiritual basis, vision within, you have the potential to see a world that allows everyone to thrive and flourish, and that's what we all, the right thinking people, correct thinking people, the loving people want, and so. Yeah, I think so going back to the very beginning, that's where it all starts from, having that vision of a caring and loving society. And then we say, why are these people doing this to the earth in the name of greed? How unhappy are they? Yeah.
Exactly. And I think to start to say, exactly, Michael, I think to start to respond to that care, right? Because I think part of Western sort of milieu is we're very individual, particularly America, but we're very individualistic. And I think
freezing again.
Responsibility, and responsibility can even become a negative word. Oh. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was just saying that responsibility even gains some negative connotations in priority. It feels as if it's imposed. I think love, actually, that spirit care, when I say care, it comes from that very deep place. And I think that there's a natural sense of responsibility. And when we do that, we don't feel so isolated and helpless and daunted, or we don't feel the impetus so much to just avoid, and to dive deeper into avoidance, because you see that too. There are many responses to this. And some people feel, well, if we're all going to go, why don't we just, party on? There's all kinds of responses. But I feel we have to take the deepest part of ourselves very seriously in this, and I think that's what's we can all do that, in whatever way that we can, really.
That's a great answer, and it's probably a good place to leave the discussion. People can find out more about you at Michael has posted
I put in the third space, your third space website,
third-space.org, and read some of your articles, and hopefully join this movement or find your own way to take what you believe in. And some of that has its own reward, and every little bit, Al Gore in one of his books said, another snowflake can break the branch. Even it's just one snowflake. Eventually there's enough weight that the branch breaks, and so one person can make a difference.
Definitely, absolutely, Annabelle. Yes.
Well, thank you, Mary, and thank you for all the work you're doing. Carry on. So I hope all goes well when you're back in England.
And thank you all for listening.
Thank you both very, very much.
Do you want to say something quick about our next guest in 3 weeks?
Oh, yeah. So our next program, Tuesday, February 28th, with the documentary filmmaker Yoruba Ricken. And I will be talking, Yoruba is African-American, and most recent feature documentary is about Rosa Parks, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, which is streaming on NBC's Peacock network. And so we'll be talking a lot about systemic racism in the United States and world, for that matter. So yeah, it should be really good also.
Right.
Yeah. So
I'll tune into that too.
yeah.
Thank you again, Mary, for
Great.
your work,
Thank
for
you.
coming on the show. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone who has come to listen. And thank you, Kitty, for waiting until I'm done to get to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next
Right.
time.
Yeah.
Right.
Peace out, everyone.
All
Yeah.
right.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.